Last week, Reform UK gave the impression that it was advancing significantly in polls, but they were minor polls. Now a major poll has put Reform UK ahead of the Conservatives and ahead of Labour. Its current polling success presents or represents a paradox in British politics. On the one hand, it looks entirely absurd given the fact that the party holds a mere 5 seats in the House of Commons, yet on the other, it's a signal that cannot be ignored. Polling above the Conservatives, hovering around Labour's numbers, marks a seismic shift in the political landscape, and whether reform is a genuine threat to the established order or merely a protest vehicle will be determined in the long run, but for now it should focus minds on serious questions about the state of British democracy and voter sentiment or voter discontent. At first glance, Reform's poll numbers suggest a political party poised for a major breakthrough. But that must be tempered with the reality that polling is not power, and enthusiasm in surveys doesn't necessarily translate to votes. The UK's first-past-the-post system is particularly unforgiving to insurgent parties. If Reform were to carry 24% of the vote nationally in a general election, it would likely return very few MPs due to vote distribution and the concentration of traditional party loyalties, and also the party machine, which Reform UK, for all its brashness, doesn't have. But the numbers indicate something more important than electoral viability. The scale of disillusion with both the Conservatives and the Labour Party is pregnant in that poll today. It reflects a growing number of voters who see the political Tweedledum and Tweedledee as exhausted, unresponsive, incapable of addressing key issues such as immigration, the economy, Britain's post-Brexit future. And in that sense, Reform's polling success is not just a freak occurrence, it's a warning sign for both the major parties. And Reform's rise has been fuelled primarily by the implosion of the Conservative vote. In the 2024 general election, the Tories already suffered their worst defeat in modern history. Now, things are getting worse. Kemi Badenoch's party is polling in third place for the first time ever in some surveys, with nearly a quarter of their 2024 votes defecting to Reform. Reform will point out that a lot of the people that it's picking up are people who didn't vote at all in the last election, but the Conservative Party is hemorrhaging its traditional base, particularly Leave voters and those prioritising stricter immigration controls go to Farage. And yet Reform's success remains more of a signal than a structural shift in British politics. For all its momentum, the party has yet to build a credible ground game at the constituency level. And while it thrives on media attention, it lacks the organisational muscle needed to mount serious electoral challenges in key battlegrounds. And Nigel Farage's Brexit party suffered from a similar weakness in 2019, gaining millions of votes but no seats. So my hunch is that discontent will be translated into the Lib Dems, or will benefit the Lib Dems rather than the Conservatives or Labour, and certainly won't benefit Reform in any serious election. But why are voters shifting to Reform? The answer is not as straightforward as immigration or Brexit betrayal, though these issues certainly play a role. And the second is a sort of sign of desperation, isn't it? Brexit betrayal. Brexit was betrayed from almost the moment the vote was taken. But it was betrayed in a particularly stupid way. So we end up with Brexit, and we end up with the worst form of Brexit, simply by dithering and delaying. That's entirely down to Theresa May. Recent polling suggests, and Lord Frost, of course, recent polling suggests that the biggest draw for Reform is not necessarily any single policy, but rather its identity as an anti-establishment party. In other words, should Reform actually get the keys to number 10, it would lose its vote immediately. Because an anti-establishment party cannot become the establishment. Voters are sick of the stale political class, and Reform offers an alternative that appears untainted by years of compromise and failure. But this is both an opportunity and a trap. Many voters see Reform as a vessel for their anger, not necessarily as a serious governing force, and the party's vague policy platform leaves it open to scrutiny. Its immigration plans, for example, offer little explanation of how deportations would be enforced if recipient countries refuse to take people back. Similarly, its economic policies are patchy, and its focus on scrapping net zero lacks clarity on what replaces it. This makes reform a perfect vehicle for protest, but an unstable foundation for government. Unless it can present a more coherent platform, it risks the fate of other insurgent parties before it: UKIP, the Brexit Party, even the SDP before them. The famous four, Shirley Williams and co., they achieved nothing really. They had to combine with the Lib Dems, with the Liberal Party. So what does the future hold? There are three main possibilities. Reform as a kingmaker, much as the SDP. If Reform's polling strength holds, it could force the Conservatives into an uneasy alliance, either formally or informally, to prevent total collapse. Some figures on the right are already calling for a Tory-Reform merger, though polling suggests that neither party's supporters are overwhelmingly enthusiastic about the idea. Reform as a disruptor is a second possibility. The more likely, the immediate likelihood is that Reform doesn't win many seats, but fundamentally reshapes Conservative politics. If Badenoch's leadership fails to stop the bleeding, and it will, the Tories will be forced to pivot right to reclaim lost voters, dragging them further towards Reform's ideological space. Or at least that's where they think they should be going. Actually, they should go back into the centre, and they would pick up a lot of the votes they've leaked to the Lib Dems. And Reform is a spent force, if that's the way they go. But I don't think that's the way the Conservative Party is heading. And then there's a possibility that Reform, the third possibility is Reform becomes a footnote. The biggest risk to Reform itself. Insurgent parties often overplay their hand, assuming that anger alone can sustain them. Without proper organisation, coherent policies, and a realistic electoral strategy, Reform could peak in the polls only to collapse under scrutiny, as UKIP did, as the SDP did, as the Brexit Party did, as almost all parties of frustration, parties of defiance do. Reform's success is a reminder that British politics is in a state of deep dissatisfaction, and whether the party becomes a permanent fixture or a passing phenomenon remains to be seen, but the warning signs are flashing, and the old order is failing, and the voters are restless, and for the first time in generations, the traditional parties can no longer take their dominance for granted. Regardless of its ultimate fate, Reform UK has already succeeded in one crucial aspect. It has forced the political class to sit up and take notice. And that in itself is something, frankly, to be taken seriously.